Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you a review of the final of the trio of lenses that Sigma released at the same time, including the 135mm f1.4, the 35mm f1.2 Mark II from their art series, and then this lens, the new 20 to 200mm f3.5-6.3 DG from their contemporary lineup. Now, for about 5 years now, I have been promoting and using the Tamron 28 to 200mm because of its unusual blend for a travel or super zoom of having, pretty great image quality and relatively good brightness in a compact form. Now, this new Sigma lens has one massive advantage over that Tamron lens. It can go all the way to 20mm, which, as you can see from this comparison, is radically wider than 28mm. That's going to be incredibly useful in a great variety of situations. However, it does have a distinctive disadvantage relative to that Tamron as well, in that it is not nearly as bright. It starts at f3.5, yes, but as we're going to see, it's f4 by not even 22mm, and it's going to reach its smallest maximum aperture by only about 88mm into the zoom range. The Tamron, by comparison, has an advantage most often anywhere between 1 and even 1 2/3 stops, depending on the area you are in the zoom range. So it's a much brighter lens. Now, there are other strengths that Sigma brings to bear that we're going to detail as a part of this review, but if you want to know the biggest strength and biggest weakness relative to what's available on the market right now, there you have it right there. And of course, Tamron is already going to counterpunch in that sometime this fall, they're going to release a new 25 to 200mm lens. So not quite as wide, but it's going to be updated in terms of build and features and the optical design. So it'll be interesting to see how that shakes out when that particular lens arrives. But right now, for $1,000, you can get a lens that has an extraordinary 10x zoom range that is still very compact and easy to bring along, and starts at an incredibly wide 20mm, something that we haven't seen from any of these travel style zooms on full frame before. And so we're going to dive in today and see if this new Sigma is worth investing in. Let's take a look. So in full disclosure, this lens was loaned to me by Gentek, which is a distributor for Sigma products here in Canada. It will be going to them after the end of this review. As always, this is a completely independent review. They have had no input on my findings, nor will they see this video before you do. So we're going to take a look at build, handling, and features here. I will give you a bit of an apology before we jump in. I am fighting a cold right now, and as you have probably heard, I'm a bit stuffed up. And so if my voice sounds a bit annoying, I apologize for that. The really standout feature of the new Sigma lens is the fact that it has such a useful zoom range. 10x zoom range that allows you to go from this and zoom all the way in to this at 200mm. That's going to be so useful in so many different situations, giving you the ability to really frame most settings in the way that you would want. And as you can see here, comparing to the 28mm of the Tamron, it is a radical difference. And so interior spaces in particular, you're going to really see a huge difference. Now, the biggest weakness, as I detailed in the intro, is the aperture here. Not only does it have an overall slower maximum aperture throughout the range, f3.5 to f6.3, even that f3.5 is a little bit deceptive. Yes, it is at 20mm, it is f3.5, but by 21.8mm, less than 2mm zooming in, it actually drops to f4. By 28.8mm, it is f4.5. I'll remind you the Tamron is f2.8 at that point. At 38mm, it becomes f5. Tamron is still f2.8. 51mm, it becomes f5.6. The Tamron is f3.5. And then at only 83.3mm, it becomes the slowest maximum aperture of f6.3, whereas the Tamron is still at f4 and in fact does not reach f5.6, its maximum aperture, until 150mm. So these lenses are pretty radically different in their light gathering potential. And that is part of the price that Sigma has paid for compressing a lot of additional focal lengths into a really quite compact lens. On top of that, this lens does have no lens-based stabilization. So that means you're going to be relying upon in-camera image stabilization. And I found that, as is often the case, particularly with Sony cameras, when you get into telephoto spaces, they're only so-so, in my opinion, when it comes to telephoto. I find that both Fuji and Nikon, Canon, all of them tend to have a little bit better stabilization of telephoto focal lengths in camera, at least in my opinion. And so I did run into some situations where I got a little bit of motion blur where I didn't expect some, and that has to do with a lack of in-camera stabilization. Also, that slow maximum aperture means that you're going to have to really keep an eye on your shutter speed, because it's pretty easy to get into a pretty low shutter speed situation if you're shooting in AV mode, for example, and not paying attention to that. Now, as far as the feature set, we do have an AF/MF switch, which is something that was lacking on the Tamron lens. It does have that lock here to keep from any kind of zoom creep taking place. As far as anything else, there are no other buttons or switches here, no aperture ring, nothing like that. I will note that the design is completely reversed in every way from the Tamron. Instead of having the manual focus ring first, we've got the zoom ring first. It zooms in the opposite direction. It focuses in the opposite direction. And so just very, very different. So if you're going back and forth, it can be a little bit confusing ergonomically reaching for those things. Sigma has done an excellent job in keeping this lens compact despite that huge zoom range. It is only 77.2 millimeters in diameter, or 3 inches, and 115.5 millimeters or 4.5 inches in length. Now, that's retracted. Obviously, it zooms out a considerable length, and so that's going to add about 75 millimeters to the overall length, but for travel, it remains really nice and compact. Now, particularly when I first got the lens, it was stiff, particularly in the wide part of the zoom range. And it still has a little bit heavier weight in that zone than what I would like, but it does feel like it is getting smoother overall. I still do find it, because it's a little bit heavy on that end, I find it a little bit hard to smoothly zoom it. And the Tamron is just a little bit more consistent, but I've also been using this Tamron for 5 years, so it's thoroughly broken in. The Sigma might do better after it is more broken in, but I did note, and I see some other reviewers as well have noted, that for them also there was some stiffness in that, so that does mitigate the zooming potential, particularly during video. Up front, we have 72 millimeter filter threads, and that's a little bit less common, but you know, it's shared with a number of other lenses from Sigma and other brands as well. The weight here is 550 grams. You can feel that, but it's far from being so heavy that you can't carry it around for a good part of the day. I think it's a great weight for all that you're getting in this particular lens. It also has a pretty thorough weather sealing, which is great. That's new for the contemporary lineup from Sigma. And so you can see from this diagram, we've got 7 seal points, starting with a gasket here at the lens mount, and then working up to some coating on the front element in addition. So nice things there. Inside, we have got 9 rounded aperture blades. And so that does help to keep a circular shape and a decent looking sun star when it is stopped down. Now, the manual focus ring is right up near the front. It doesn't have a lot of damping, so it's not as nice feeling as the 2 Art Series lenses that I just got through reviewing, but it is nice and responsive because of the HLA focus motor. And I will also note that these Sigma lenses all have full-time manual override, which a lot of lenses don't. And so I find that to be very, very useful, and appreciate that. Now, because this lens goes so wide, it's got a shallower than typical lens hood for a lens like this, and that is at 20 millimeters. Obviously, it couldn't have a very deep hood because it would start to provide some additional shading in terms of vignette. And so it's a shallow hood, but fortunately, flare resistance is good. They kind of, I think, offset that through the optical design, and so no major problem there. We have a minimum focus distance in this lens, and it really varies. And so as little as 16.5 centimeters, and it will grow up to much longer, I think even around 60 centimeters on the long end. But what's interesting here is that you're going to get your maximum magnification actually between 28 and 85 millimeters. And while the minimum focus distance varies, the amount of magnification you can get does not. You can get all the way up to a 0.50 times magnification, or a 1:2 magnification ratio. That is hugely useful, and I find it particularly useful at the 85 millimeter end, where I think the minimum focus distance is something like 26 centimeters. So useful enough working distance, but you're able to really blur out backgrounds. It's quite useful, and so I really appreciate that aspect of the lens design as well. Finally, the cost is basically $1,000 US dollars, 999 US dollars, 1,300 here in Canada. And so it is considerably more expensive than the Tamron, which is about 700 US dollars. But of course, the Tamron's been out for 5 years. And Tamron, as mentioned in the intro, does have a new 25-200 millimeter G2 lens. We don't yet know what the price of that lens is going to be, but I suspect it is going to be closer to the Sigma. I wouldn't be surprised if it comes in at like an $899 price point. And so it's, it is on the expensive end for a lens like this, but it also is doing some things that no lens like this has done before. So let's talk autofocus. Like most of Sigma's recent lenses, the 20-200 millimeter uses their HLA focus motor, which stands for high-speed linear actuator. It's their new high-powered focus system that gives you quicker, quieter, and more accurate autofocus results. It's got more thrust than their previous STM focus motors and is just generally better all around. Now, some people think with these super zoom lenses, because they have a long focal length at the end, that they're like sports lenses. That's not really true. And some people will ask me questions pretty often actually about, say, comparing a 70-300 lens with a 16-300 millimeter lens. Well, the latter lens is just not going to be the same. It's not really a dedicated sports lens or even telephoto lens, it's a general purpose lens. That being said, focus here is quick enough that I think you can use it in a pretty wide variety of applications. What I have found with a lot of these zoom lenses in the past is that while focus speed was fine on the wide end, it would slow way down on the telephoto end. With this new HLA focus motor, that's not the case. You can see that autofocus really is just as snappy at 200 millimeters as it is at 20 millimeters. And so that does mean that you can use it in a wider variety of situations. I used it for, not really for sports, but I did use it capturing golf swings and throwing horseshoes and cornhole and things at some various events that I was a part of. And it worked fine for all of that. Focus was well fast enough to keep up. While I didn't try to do any kind of actual birding, if I was trying to just take shots of birds flying off of a telephone wire early in the morning, obviously no problem picking them up. So I would say that for most of the things that people actually use while traveling, there's going to be plenty of speed here. Because of that slower maximum aperture, it's not going to be quite as good indoors in a variety of situations. You're going to have to get that ISO way up to accommodate that slow maximum aperture. But if you're shooting outdoors while you're traveling, you're just trying to capture events moving, I think focus speed is going to be perfectly adequate for those kinds of situations. So as far as the focus motor itself, that component of the lens, pretty fantastic. So how about video AF? Again, in this instance, that HLA focus motor really serves this lens very well. Another thing that serves it well is a minimal amount of focus breathing. And so here I had things set around 40-50 millimeters for this particular shot for my focus pull test. And you can see that focus breathing is essentially non-existent here. It does an exceptional job there, and that remains pretty true even on the telephoto end. So great job, Sigma, in controlling that. At the same time, on the negative side, this lens is far from being parfocal. And so if you are zooming while videoing, you will have moments of lag where a focus needs to resume once again. I also found that with my copy, as mentioned previously, it was a little bit sticky, particularly at the early stages. And so I wasn't able to get really smooth zooms anyway. It did seem to improve over the course of several weeks of use, however. When it came to my hand test, transitions were basically perfect, transitioning from my hand to my eye and back and forth with no issues at all there. Likewise, in other static shots, focus was fine. I've been shooting all of the outdoor segments on the lens, and so as you can see, it has no problem in keeping focused on myself and on my eye as I am shooting these segments. I will note, however, that when I tried to zoom in close, that at close focus distances, it wasn't quite as good, and so I wasn't able to hold focus quite as well. So you will want to watch out for that as you're kind of going in. Focus isn't naturally going to transition into that closest zone. So just watch out for that. In general, however, I would say that video focus has been excellent. And again, for a travel lens, I think you're going to be really delighted with the options you have available to you for capturing video content. All right, let's talk optics. This is a really complex optical design, as you might expect, with 18 elements in 14 groups. That includes 4 aspherical elements, 1 FLD element, and 3 SLD elements. The MTF chart is interesting because in both 20 millimeter and 200 millimeter, you have a really strong meridional line, which is the solid line. You can see it's a really strong performance, but the sagittal axis, which is the dotted line, is kind of shaky. And so that means that there will be some astigmatism, and at times contrast won't be as exceptional as what you might want. But what I found is that I saw mostly strong real-world performance. There were some instances where I felt like contrast wasn't exceptional, but others where it was good. Let me just say that it's probably a matter of this lens relying more on the contrast of the situation itself. And I found that in lower contrast situations, it didn't quite work as well. You know, there's some lenses that they're able to produce the magic by themselves. These type of lenses, that is not their strength. Their strength is being able to have great flexibility, and so you have them along, and so that you can capture the magical moments, but don't expect the optics to do the heavy lifting for you. And I think if you have that kind of mentality, you'll be happier with lenses like this. In general, though, I thought that the performance was fairly good. Now, there are some serious compromises that went into this lens. Going to 20 millimeters is something that's never been done before, but as we're going to see right now, maybe there's a reason why it hasn't been done before. To get there, the engineers had to compromise to have an incredible amount of barrel distortion. As you can see, without correction, it has just massive amounts of barrel distortion and vignette at 20 millimeters. It required a plus 39 for me to correct it. For the barrel distortion, but you can see it's a really strong mustache pattern, so that just creates lots of pincushion distortion at the edges. And likewise, when it comes to vignette, I had to max out the slider, so plus 100 in Lightroom, and I still could have gone a little bit more. And so there are some major optical compromises, and I found even the correction profile, there's still a bit of barrel distortion and a bit of vignette left over even after applying that profile. So it's, you know, optically, it's really relying on the software to get that done. Much less of an issue as you begin to zoom in, however. It will pretty quickly invert to a pincushion style distortion, and it kind of remains consistent from 50 millimeters. I tested at 50 millimeters, 135 millimeters, and then at 200 millimeters, and I got pretty much the same results all along there. So anywhere between a -10 and a -11 to correct a bit of pincushion distortion, but nice and linear, corrects just fine. And vignette is also quite mild, requiring in the low plus 40s to correct for. And so no big deal there. And so really it's on that very wide end that the compromises were made by the engineers to get us to 20 millimeters. And so it comes at a cost. In terms of longitudinal style chromatic aberrations, I tested at multiple focal lengths. I didn't really see anything, and so it comes off well in that. Likewise, in some really high contrast images I took, I didn't see a lot of fringing, so I was impressed by that. And also there is a minimal amount of lateral style chromatic aberrations, which is also very good. Now, when it comes to testing the sharpness sides of things, I found that on my high resolution A7R5, so that's 61 megapixels, and I show you the crops at 200% magnification, there's definitely some give and take at the 20 millimeter end. The center looks fantastic, the mid-frame looks very good, but the corners, particularly the far corners, are quite soft. What's more, I found that as I attempted to stop down, even at f8, which I would consider probably the best as it gets, it's still fairly soft in the extreme corners. I found that to be true also in real-world shots, that the corners never got super sharp. At the same time, I found that images were good. As long as I wasn't looking too hard at those extreme corners, I was quite happy with the results that I could get. Now, to be fair, the Sigma lens is never as good as the Tamron on the wide end. Tamron obviously didn't go nearly as wide, so at 28 millimeters, it's strong, and the Sigma lens all the way through 28 millimeters is never quite as strong, particularly in the corners. And so again, it's that compromise. You know, you can shoot considerably wider, but you're not getting quite as good of optical performance. Now, diffraction is going to come after, starting by f11 and getting stronger at the minimum apertures. Minimum aperture varies as well as the maximum aperture, and so at 20 millimeters, minimum aperture is f22. By the time you get to around 85, 88 millimeters, the minimum aperture is going to become f40. And so at any of those, that is going to look quite soft due to the effects of diffraction. So I would avoid those minimum apertures where at all possible. As I move throughout the zoom range, what I found is that 50 millimeters, it isn't quite as sharp in the center of the frame, but it's more consistent across the frame. The mid frame and the corners in particular definitely look stronger and have more potential for sharpening up. Real world images at, anywhere between 35 and let's say 75 millimeters all looked really, really good. No problems there. At 135 millimeters, I noted a little bit of drop in contrast, just a little bit less potential in general, but I did note by 200 millimeters that there was a little bit more contrast available there. However, I didn't notice a lot of improvement when stopping down, which stands to reason because the lens is already at f6.3 throughout basically all the telephoto range, which means that you can only stop down 2/3 of a stop and you're already at f8. And beyond that, you start to see some effects of diffraction. So there's just less potential on these slower variable aperture zooms for them to get, a lot of additional sharpness from stopping down. As I noted, the real-world results were a little bit situational. Sometimes I found that, the images look really, really crisp, and then other times where there was less contrast there just wasn't optics to make things pop in those situations. The bokeh quality is going to vary somewhat. Now, because you can get close and you have a long focal length, you can obliterate backgrounds and really, really blur them out in some situations. However, where the background is visible, you can see from this crop from specular highlights that they're kind of busy. There's some outlining and some junk inside them. And so that just means that in situations where you have a less defocused background, things are going to have a little bit more outlining and be a little bit more apparent. That's true of all these super zoom lenses. Like, you can only engineer so much of that. It's not going to have prime-like performance at any focal length. I did find the colors looked good in all the shots. I was generally happy with the overall appearance of photos I was able to take. I also found that the lens exhibited good flare resistance despite having that shallow hood. Optically, it held up really well, and so a lot of my backlit images, I didn't notice any negative effects from the sun. So kudos to Sigma on that front. So all told, there are compromises here, which is true of all of these, travel zooms, super zoom lenses. One of the reasons why I've been touting the Tamron is that it had fewer of those than most lenses. Now, obviously, it doesn't have nearly as exciting a zoom range by comparison, but it does manage to have a little bit less of optical flaws relative to the Sigma. At the same time, the Sigma does a lot of stuff really, really well, and I think that despite its shortcomings, it still is an interesting lens optically at the end of the day. So my conclusion is that in many ways, the greatest strengths of this lens are also the sources of its greatest weakness. The fact that it goes to 20 millimeters gives you so many additional options when it comes to framing, particularly in interior spaces. Unfortunately, the slow maximum aperture also means that you're going to have to jack that ISO up even more in those interior spaces to accommodate. On top of that, I also noted that a lot of the strongest optical flaws are going to be found at 20 millimeters, where Sigma's engineers had to make the greatest compromises for that to happen. So by far, you've got the heaviest amount of vignette and distortion there, and the corners aren't as sharp as what we see across the rest of the frame. In many ways, however, this lens is amazingly competent, and it offers great flare resistance, it offers very good colors, and of course that half-life size magnification level opens up even more potential options for getting images. The fact that we're relying on in-camera stabilization means that there will be some situations that maybe it's not as effective as a lens-based stabilization. At the same time, however, I can understand why Sigma did what they did, because it allowed them to keep the lens smaller, lighter, and maybe a little bit cheaper as well. At the end of the day, however, $1,000 is not particularly cheap, particularly when you do have the already strong Tamron 28-200 millimeter available for $699 or about $700. At the same time, however, 28 millimeters is far from 20 millimeters. And if your primary objection to the Tamron lens has been the fact that it just doesn't go wide enough, the Sigma is the perfect solution for all of that. So I do think that this is going to be a lens that is going to not only end up in a lot of people's bags, but also is going to be a very useful option if you're looking for a single lens solution for things like travel. Having an all-in-one solution like this with the 10 times zoom ratio means that you don't have to worry about carrying additional lenses, you don't have to worry about changing lenses, and the fact that it does have pretty good weather sealing also means that if you're shooting in more moist or dusty environments, it just alleviates even more of those concerns. So this is a lens I think that is going to be really useful for those that are looking for something just like this. Thanks for watching, have a great day, and let the light in.